I'm John Lorden, and I've been looking into mysterious occurrences on my YouTube channel since 2015. Joining me today are some friends from uncovered.com.
I'm Rachel Roslet, a forensic psychologist and head of case research and data at Uncovered.
I'm Andrea Cipriano. I'm also a forensic psychologist, and I'm a case researcher and content specialist at Uncovered.
Welcome back to LordanArts Uncovered. And today, we're looking into the 2019 mysterious death of Kaysera Stops Pretty Places from Hardin, Montana. Hardin is part of Bighorn County, and in 2020, the population was 3,818. Hardin is located just north of the Crow Indian Reservation, the largest reservation out of Montana's 7 tribal lands, with 2.2 million acres and a population of just under 8,000 people. The reservation is made up of a few small towns, 3 massive mountain ranges, 2 major rivers, dozens of tributaries, and vast amounts of ranch ground. Kaysera and her family are proud Crow Nation members. So when Kaysera vanished on August 24th, 2019, less than a half mile from the Crow Reservation boundary, the whole community immediately jumped into action. Then, on August 29th, Kaysera's body was found in the same neighborhood, but her family was left in the dark until mid-September. Her body was cremated almost immediately, leaving her family with more questions than answers, particularly questions aimed at the police and coroner. And of course, the big question of what exactly happened to Kaysera. Let's turn it over to our case experts to learn more. Rachel, Andrea, what can you tell us about Kaysera and how does this timeline come together?
So Kaysera Stops Pretty Places was born on August 14th, 2001 to her parents Geraldine Bulltail Stops and Alan Stops. Both sides of her family are members of the Crow, Northern Cheyenne, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations. Because of this, Kaysera was proud of her indigenous heritage. Kaysera spent her childhood and her teen years both in Missoula, Montana, and Hardin, Montana, where she ultimately attended high school. In 2019, Kaysera was 19 years old, and she was living with her paternal grandmother, Yolanda Frazier, who was also her legal guardian.
And by all accounts, we know from friends and family who have spoken to the media that Kaysera was incredibly athletic, and she had always been involved in various sports. She played basketball, track, football, and she was even skilled at wrestling. But Kaysera was more than just her physical strength and her agility. She had a serious creative side, and she was a member of the choir and the drama club, where she performed in several different school productions. Kaysera dreamed of becoming a professional actress and hoped to study performing arts in college.
We also know that Kaysera had a huge heart for all living things, people and animals included. Her friends and family say she was known to rescue stray animals in need. And in our research, we also learned through quotes and comments from family members that Kaysera had faced many hardships while she lived on the reservation. Her aunt, Dr. Grace Bulltail, said that to people outside of native reservations, understanding life in Bighorn County is like learning about a whole different world. And with the staggering number of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the area, for Kaysera, Grace said growing up there was simply not safe.
Mm-hmm. It's heartbreaking to hear a family member have to say that. And Grace has also spoken with the crew at Dateline, further discussing life in Bighorn County, where she said, quote, "If something happens to you there, if something happens to your loved one, you're on your own."
I just want to add a little context regarding the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples Crisis, commonly denoted by the acronym MMIP. You might be more familiar with MMIW, which focuses on these occurrences in the female population, but in either case, this crisis is a very serious one. Now, while sharing some facts and talking about one particular case, it's really just the tip of the iceberg. I do hope that this might interest people in learning more about MMIP and MMIW. The National Crime Information Center has found that Indigenous girls and women are murdered at a rate 10 times higher than all other ethnicities, and that more than half of Indigenous women experience sexual violence in their lifetime. More than half. According to the Centers for Disease Control, murder is the third leading cause of death for Indigenous women. Clearly, these are alarming stats, and it's an epidemic that, for some reason, is not talked about a whole lot in the major media. Things might be getting a tiny bit better, but not for the scale of this problem.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And, we've read that experts have found that in the majority of murders where Native people are the victims, the perpetrators are non-Native people going into Native-owned land. And the lack of communication combined with jurisdictional issues between state, local, federal, and tribal law enforcement makes it nearly impossible to begin the investigative process. And this is something that we do see later in Kaysera's case. And it's also important to note that in Bighorn County, they have one of the highest rates of missing or murdered Indigenous women in the entire United States.
It's just awful. And quite honestly, there are just far too many of these stories that get practically no attention. So now we know a little bit about the crisis. And by the way, that also reaches into Canada, but we cover tons of those cases on this channel as well. Let's dive into the start of the case timeline for Kaysera's case.
So the case surrounding Kaysera's suspicious death actually begins a few days before she goes missing. So we know in mid-August, Kaysera and her 15-year-old brother went to the Crow Fair in Bighorn County. And this is a weeks-long cultural celebration, which happens on the third week of August. While there, and seemingly unprovoked, law enforcement officers began beating Kaysera's brother. And he is just a young boy who is wheelchair bound. So Kaysera immediately tries to intervene, and she even films the incident with her cell phone. And it's because of her video that we know some of the perpetrating officers are also Bighorn County Sheriff's deputies. Eventually, Kaysera will post the footage on social media. Unfortunately, we could not find any of that footage online.
Mm-hmm. And Kaysera was known for being somebody who stood up for injustice. So there's reason to believe that she would have been really persistent with posting and documenting this incident on social media. And it's because of this and more information that we will dive into later that many people in the community begin to simply distrust the police.
Mm-hmm. So this brings us to the late night hours of Saturday, August 24th, 2019. Kaysera goes out and sees some local friends. She was last seen hanging outside a home on Rangeview Drive in Hardin on the early morning hours of August 25th, 2019. With her there were two females aged 17 and 19 and a 23-year-old man. They were drinking, and it's because this 23-year-old man had brought the group alcohol. So around 3 a.m., there is an argument that ensues between that 23-year-old man and his girlfriend. And a neighbor remotely activates the light and the horn of her vehicle to disrupt this fight, and it sent everyone running in different directions. Kaysera reportedly fled into one of the backyards, and she was never seen or heard from again.
The official Justice for Kaysera YouTube channel, started by Kaysera's family, has a video that's a walking tour of Rangeview Drive. I've also pulled up a map, so we're going to take a look at the map and just a little bit of the video to kind of get a better understanding of where this is happening and what exactly is going down there. So this is the corner of Rangeview Drive and Mitchell Avenue. I believe the 23-year-old might live on this street as well. Someone that's part of this friend circle also lives on this street. Based on what the family says in their video, somewhere in front of this house on the right is where this argument is kind of taking place. And this is likely the house that turns on. I don't know if they hit the panic alarm for their car, but it seems like that might be what they do. And then everyone scatters from here. Now, we're going to hear a little bit later, it takes her family a while to figure out this information, but even here on Google Maps, we can see that there's a memorial area for where her body was found. Her body was found, however, on the inside of the fence line. And we know that her body is effectively, well, she is deceased for several days. I'm kind of questioning if her body was actually here the whole time or not. When you look at it with this current view, which this is a street view from October 2021, it looks like if you had a body lying face down here in this corner, it would be very obvious. One of the points of the video that the family made is to show that there is regular traffic that's just driving up and down this road all the time. In terms of people walking by, the sidewalk is on the opposite side of the street, but we do know that someone is running, and they're obviously, they do spot her body. One thing to point out is it looks very simple and clean now, but at the time there was a lot more growth going on in this corner, almost similar to what you have happening in this neighbor's yard. So let's just run just a little bit of their video so we get a little sense of it. So here you can see the memorial, and you can see there's almost, I think they took out a tree or two from back there. Mm-hmm. And also worth noting, there is a wood pile. As you're walking up here, there's a bunch of wood that's all stacked up over here as well. Which just kind of leads me to the question of, if you're really trying to hide her body and stop it from being discovered, why are you going to put it next to the fence facing a road that's a major thoroughfare? And even if you are, why aren't you going to take the time for covering it up in some way when you have something so obvious as a pile of wood sitting right there? If they would have taken 15 minutes to put that on top of her body, the discovery of her body probably would have taken a lot longer.
It seems likely that this body was put there to be found.
Yeah, it does seem like it. And I don't know what to think about how long the body was at this location when we're looking at this. I mean, with all this traffic coming by, I mean, there's some other factors we're going to learn about that might have helped it be a little tougher to find there. And also just the closeness of, this is right around the corner from where this event happened, where, it sounds like the neighbors, I don't know if they called police, but it looks like there was a police car that came by, at least according to what's reported in the video. And that, this group of kids, some of them underage drinking, one of them potentially, well, I guess three of them, split. Yeah. They all go running off.
Right. We know that the 23-year-old man, he fled to the west, and that the two other girls were together and they fled east. And so, in general, this whole area is very suburban. So it's kind of hard to tell, where they were going, if they were going to somebody else's house. But I think the important thing to note there is that Kaysera is alone. She doesn't run away with anybody else. She's just by herself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I think, Andrea, we know based on some reporting that it's not as if that backyard was, always vacant. Like the people did go into that backyard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm happy you mentioned that. In Kaysera's, the family members' original video where, like we just saw the clips of the backyard, there's an apple tree that's fully covered with ready to eat apples. And the grass in the backyard is pretty well maintained. And so it just begs the question, when was the person who lives there, when were they last out? Do they pick their apples frequently? Do they go and collect them? Just some other questions about who is going back there and how often, because that could help, clear up some of the timeline of, was Kaysera there that entire time? I don't know.
Yeah. And I mean, I want to point out that I don't think, the people that live at that home would be considered suspects or something like that. In this case, it just seems really, really dopey if they were, that they would put her body in the backyard in that particular location. So I don't quite believe that. But is there some connectivity in some way? Is someone trying to get back at them for some reason by doing that? Like to make them look suspicious in some way? Why that location in that way? There's a lot of questions in that itself. Either we're looking at someone that did want the discovery of her body to happen relatively quickly from the point whenever her body was placed there, which I don't know in that timeline of a week. I don't know when it is, but or it's someone that's just very inexperienced, maybe they were in a rush, just trying to, like literally throw her over the fence and just bolt or something. So
that location would be easy to just pull up quickly and place her over the fence and leave quickly without much attention.
Yeah. And that's the other thing, just in terms of motive, like, we're talking a 19-year-old girl, like what kind of hate can someone have for this person that they would want to A, murder her, and then B, dump her body in a way like that? Like, I think that's why it's interesting to talk about, I'm sure I understand why some people might be looking kind of at law enforcement with that whole interaction that happened with her and posting the video online and stuff. Cause it's like, okay, that's pretty serious. You could sure, get some hate going off a situation like that. But yeah. So they all split. She goes running off on her own. The friends wind up together again, but Kaysera isn't with them.
And she isn't seen by friends or family again. So we know that Yolanda Frazier, Kaysera's grandmother, who, again, Kaysera was living with at the time, she immediately knows something is wrong when she wakes up that morning. Yolanda actually reached out to the local police that morning on August 25th, 2019, and explained to them how just unlikely it was that Kaysera would not come home. And not only that, but how unlikely it was that Kaysera would not communicate about where she was even going or if she was staying with a friend. And so despite all of this, the police wave off her concerns, and no police report or missing persons report was ever filed, and no official alert was ever issued to the community either.
So because law enforcement seems disinclined to do something, this leaves Yolanda and her family to their own devices. So on August 25th, Kaysera had plans to meet up with her mom, Geraldine Boltail, so that the two could travel to North Dakota and visit relatives. Of course, Kaysera never arrives for that. And this was incredibly strange because Kaysera had talked a lot about her excitement for this trip. And even more worryingly, Kaysera's normal social media activity was non-existent. She had not posted anything or chatted with any friends since the 24th. So because of this, Kaysera's aunt, Priscilla Brown Boltail, also tried to report Kaysera missing, but she was told by the Bighorn County Police that there was a mandatory waiting period before filing a report. This is not the law in Montana.
No, they say, the first 48 hours are the most important, and saying no and denying that is a big problem in this case. So, but since the police decide to essentially do nothing, the family keeps searching, and unbeknownst to them, investigators discover Kaysera's remains 5 days later on August 29th. And this is after a man who lived close by, Jason Cummings, was jogging along Mitchell Avenue and called 911 to report human remains that he saw in a completely fenced-in backyard, just as we saw earlier. And so the Bighorn County Sheriff's Office arrived on the scene at 6:52 p.m. And it's important to note that members of the responding team are these same officers who filmed, or that Kaysera filmed beating her brother just days prior. And the officers discovered the remains of a young woman in a face-down position, wearing a black long-sleeve shirt, tan-colored pants, and black sandals. The remains were in the northeast corner of the backyard, and by 6:55 p.m., all local authorities concurred that the scene was a death investigation. So by 7:30, the county coroner formally issued a death pronouncement.
Kaysera's remains were secured into a plastic bag, and they were delivered to the Montana State Crime Lab in Billings for medical examiners to conduct an autopsy. Along with the remains, the investigators discovered two things in the hip pockets of her pants, her Samsung cell phone and a butane torch lighter. So even though the investigators now had remains of a young girl fitting the exact description that family members had provided to the police only a few days earlier, they did not contact Kaysera's family about what they had found.
It's just kind of unbelievable. Like we looked up. I mean, yes, this is a county sheriff's department, so it's not like a local police department. So they're a little bit bigger in terms of size, but we're talking about an employee count of somewhere around like 17 officers or something like that. This information, first of all, stopping the missing persons report from being taken fully, gap number one. But even outside of that, this is still relatively kind of small town feeling. And knowing that, you know, these are some of the same officers that had interacted with her previously, like what's the likelihood that they weren't able to recognize her maybe by her clothing or something along those lines? Not to mention the fact that we're only talking about 5 days, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So what does the autopsy conclude, basically? What's cause of death, manner of death, any of that information?
Yeah, so Kaysera's remains were taken to a private coroner's office at Bullis Mortuary. And it's important to note that Terry Bullis of Bullis Mortuary is both a private coroner with his own business, and he's also an elected official coroner for the county. So he wears these two hats. And for whatever reason, he decides to take these remains to his private business. So once at Bullis Mortuary, the autopsy is conducted at 9 a.m. on August 30th, and it was concluded that there was, quote, no evidence of injury or natural disease. Toxicology testing of blood detected the presence of ethanol, although no neck injuries were detected at autopsy, and asphyxia cause of death cannot be excluded. At this time, the cause and manner of death are classified as undetermined. Cause and manner of death may be reclassified in the future if additional information becomes available, end quote. And so it was later determined in 2021, based on an independent review of materials that a forensic pathologist did, that a size of the fly larva collected by the sheriff's office at the death scene, they said, quote, it appeared to be compatible with the death near the time that Kaysera was last known alive and the local weather data. So in other words, they say that she died in those overnight hours of August 25th.
This conclusion sounds like remains that were found 6 months after the fact, like fully skeletonized remains. Like this, this type of conclusion for someone that was killed 5 days previous is kind of unheard of for me. And just that whole statement, there's no evidence of injury or natural disease. Oh, okay. Well then. Like, what kind of analysis is this?
There's so much lacking. It's almost as if the autopsy report says something, but really nothing, all at the same time.
Yeah. That might be strangulation. Yeah.
It's not natural, but it's not really murder. We're not sure.
Right.
So in looking at the presence of the ethanol a little further, they noted that the exact amount was 0.149 blood ethanol concentration at the time of her discovery. So while we know that it's considered illegal to drive with that level of intoxication, that's not even really close enough to an amount of alcohol that would kill a young woman. Experts on the matter have also told the media that the blood alcohol concentration was not a serious concern. So lots of people are saying that shouldn't have been cause for her death. Moreover, it reportedly took some time for the investigators to positively identify that these remains were Kaysera. They say, quote, significant decomposition was a challenge, and she was ultimately identified on September 9th through dental records.
Now, I've looked into some info before on alcohol deaths, and typically I see that you might have potential issues like that when you're talking like a 0.3, but like a 0.149, no. And at 0.45, it's considered likely to die if you get that intoxicated. But 0.149, like, I don't know.
I think it's also interesting that the significant decomposition remark, when she had only been dead a few days before they found her body.
Mm-hmm. And what I think is super interesting too, I know this is Montana at, the end of the summer with heat, and I was looking at the temperatures for like those first couple days, and the high like never gets over the high 80s, and at night it's in the low 50s. So to me, this, I don't think of images of scorched desert and severe decomposition. It just seems like, honestly, like a normal temperature range. And I don't know that would contribute to severe decomp.
Yeah, I'm very surprised by the severe decomp too, unless there was some agent used to help accelerate it in some way. Just looking here at aftermath.com about what happens in human decomposition, there's basically 4 different stages. And with the time frames that they're showing here, she should be in what was the bloat stage. Basically, the body starts to bloat and blood-containing foam leaks from the mouth and the nose. She wouldn't actually hit the active decay stage until 8 days after death. So how are they having this problem? I don't know. I'm really surprised by all that.
And you mentioned she shouldn't have shown much decomposition, if any, unless something was done to accelerate decomposition, which if that was the case, then it clearly was not a natural death, and they could have easily ruled it as a homicide. So,
right.
It, like so many things in this case, there are so many conflicting statements that are made by law enforcement here.
Yeah. Speaking of another conflict, Andrea, what happens with the remains?
Yeah. So we know that during this point in the identification process, Kaysera's remains are actually moved to the Montana Department of Justice Crime Lab in Billings, Montana. And DNA samples were taken from under Kaysera's fingernails and other key body part locations. And then they were sent to the State Department of Justice's lab for analysis. But still, the lab didn't find any foreign DNA samples on any of the tested samples.
Okay, if you're fighting for your life, like just the likelihood they didn't find any foreign DNA on her at all. Like this is just another one of those points in the column. And I'm not necessarily trying to drive towards this, but just there's things about this that aren't making sense. We can't get a really solid conclusion from the coroner in terms of what's going on. We've got someone that's a known athlete, track runner, wrestler. She's not going to be fighting for her life in a way that's going to leave some type of DNA, especially under her fingernails. It does just make it seem suspicious.
And how likely is it that this young woman who is hanging out with 3 friends all night long doesn't have any of their DNA? Like she has no foreign DNA on her at all. I'm not, a DNA analyst, but it seems unlikely that only, she didn't have anything on her that they could trace.
And the pause in terms of, the family's trying to get a missing persons case filed. They're not hearing from law enforcement. They're even asking like, hey, we've heard, and they're not getting the dots connected for them. It's really hard to believe that this is all just, oops. But we know that they had the dental records confirmed on September 9th. So at that point, the family should have been contacted and confirmed that it was her, correct?
Correct. But they weren't. I grew up in a town this small, and I can safely say that, people, if they are missing, about it. Word travels fast. And actually, we're going to see that's how they found out about this. So I think it is very unprofessional at best that they didn't alert the family to the fact that they had recovered a body, and that they were checking to see if it was Kaysera. So 2 days after Kaysera's remains were found, and while they're doing all of this stuff with sending her body back and forth everywhere, her grandmother, Yolanda, was contacted on August 31st by her brother, who says that his daughter read on Twitter that the police found a quote, a stops girl. So they were using her last name on the 29th. So they found out that, well, they hear that Kaysera has been found through Twitter. And as anyone would be, Yolanda is horrified. And she contacts Kaysera's mother and aunt to follow up on that tip from Twitter.
So on September 1st, and this is 10 days before Kaysera is eventually positively identified, Kaysera's mother and her family go to the mortuary to see if the body is Kaysera's. And they're told simply that it isn't hers, despite describing the clothing that Kaysera was wearing when she went missing. So then it's on the 11th that Kaysera's family is finally notified by the Bullis mortuary that the body found was indeed Kaysera, and her family is never notified by Bighorn County Sheriff or by the county coroner.
Yeah, I think, it's just, why wouldn't the coroner say, we have a body, we are trying to confirm the identity, but he tells her, no, it's not her. It just is adding insult to injury here.
Yeah.
On September 12th, Kaysera's parents are told by Terry Bullis, the owner of Bullis Mortuary and the county coroner, that Kaysera's remains have to be cremated in order to be returned to the family. And the family is distraught at this idea because cremation is against their cultural beliefs. Also, they wouldn't be able to have an independent autopsy performed to confirm what the county coroner had found.
I don't know that I've ever heard of this before, of someone being told, oh no, we have to cremate. I have never, I've heard that, you can't have an open casket at a wake or something like that, but we have to cremate the remains, and especially against a cultural belief.
Yeah, I'm just going to shake my head until it falls off, because to me, it's just so outlandish and so disrespectful, cultural beliefs aside, to tell somebody what you can and can't do with a family member's remains doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, that's really off.
This whole situation with Terry Bullis is just very strange, especially considering that at the time, Kaysera's remains are at the Department of Justice Crime Lab, and they're not even under his care. So the family, understandably, wants another local funeral home to handle the arrangement, but Bullis uses his authority as county coroner to say, nope, Kaysera has to come back to my funeral home. And he has Kaysera cremated before other family members are even able to make it to Hardin to say goodbye.
This sounds like a nightmare. Like, this sounds like a fictional crime drama that I'd be watching and go, oh, there's no way that would happen. Like, are you kidding me? Like, first of all, there's no conflict of interest here. We've got this guy that's in a role where he can effectively drive business towards himself. And then I'm sure he's going to bill it back, bill it back to the county.
Well, yeah. So I have actual goosebumps right now just thinking about it. I remember doing research for this, that, like you said, the family pays for Kaysera's cremation. He essentially says, if you want her remains back, it has to go through me, and she has to be cremated through me. And he accepts their payment that day. So he doesn't even cremate her yet, and he charges them for the action.
Wow.
It's so heartbreaking. And like you said, this is truly like the worst nightmare for a family member, honestly.
Yeah.
I really feel for this family because, on top of finding out that your loved one has passed away, around every corner, they are disenfranchised. They're not allowed to know that remains have been discovered, and they're actively looking to see if it's Kaysera. We'll see that they can't figure out where she was found. They make her be cremated. It's just insult to injury around every corner. They are it's just like the system is working against them.
And they're not asking for anything out of the norm at all. Like, these are just basics. We've looked into enough cases to know, like, these are the steps that you take when you have a missing loved one. And You have to be a squeaky wheel when it comes to law enforcement frequently to try to get the help that you actually need. They're doing things pretty much I do have a page where I've actually put out information on missing persons cases, and they're literally following it almost by the book. It's hard to not look at this situation and to wonder, is there some form of racism, or it's really, really tough to see these types of elements and think that. But outside of that, I have run into cases before where I'm like, what is up with this coroner? And I've gone looking into what does it take to be a coroner in that particular location in Montana. To be eligible for the office of coroner at the time of election or appointment to office, a person must be a high school graduate. Or you have to have the equivalency, basically like a GED or something like that. Each coroner, you guys are going to love this, before entering the duties of office shall certify to the county clerk that they have satisfactorily completed the basic coroner course of study. Right? I mean, that sounds good. That sounds legit. But how long is that course? They're saying that they need to conduct a 40-hour basic coroner course of study. 1 week. But even outside of that, before they begin their duties, they either have to have that education done, or they have to at least tell the county clerk, I intend to take the course.
Oh, God. Oh, that's so bad.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
And this is an elected position too, correct?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
It sounds like this guy has his own, or had his own mortuary business, and then said, oh, an elected position is open that I kind of fit the bill for, so I'm going to apply, and gives himself both hats and both levels of authority. And essentially, he's doing whatever he wants.
Yeah. And takes a week off.
With no qualifications. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. I also have this over at dojmt.gov, where they're talking about the actual basic coroner course that you could take. It looks like the last time they offered it was in December. There it is, December 14th through the 18th. All you need is a week, ladies. And if you're going to stay there, if you want to actually, have them put you in a room for the whole thing, $15 a day, and only $22 for a full meal plan. So for cheaper than I can go on vacation anywhere, you can effectively be taken care of for the entire week that you're studying for these 40 credit hours. You do have to have follow-up education, but I think it's 16 hours every 2 years, something like that you need to keep it up with.
Our whole system around this is probably one we could have a whole episode just in and of itself about this.
Yes.
Whether it's medical examiners or coroners, and are they elected officials? Do they have to be a physician by training? Or do they not have to have any training at all? It's crazy. I live in a county where it's an elected position and you're not even required to be an MD.
Yeah. Yeah. And it varies. It varies state to state. Like, can't we at least get some type of unification at a nationwide level of, okay, this is the basics. Like, we're not going to let you states do this little 1 week training thing anymore.
I know.
They have to have some type of secondary education in this particular area. We also had a calendar put together by Andre. Andre, you want to explain what this is and take us through this?
Yeah, I know I've mentioned in previous episodes, and I'll say again, I'm very much a visual learner. And so a timeline that is as congested as this one is, I think seeing it a little bit more laid out can be really helpful for viewers. And so what I really did was just color code Kaysera's family in purple and the incidences that are happening with the coroners in yellow, to really just kind of illustrate the dichotomy of the experiences over these 3 weeks. And we see in multiple different areas that we don't have clear details on where Kaysera's remains are at the time. They truly go back and forth between the DOJ crime lab and Bolus's crime lab. And it's just this constant back and forth. And of course, we also know that Kaysera's family tries repeatedly to get answers about who are these remains, who do they belong to, and then just get blocked every single time. And I think what's also important to note with the dental records of her being identified conclusively on the 9th by the dental records, the family, it still takes a while for them to hear about it. So all in all, just trying to illustrate, how tumultuous these 3 weeks must have been for the family, not knowing what was going on in the background.
Absolutely.
It's really curious to me that they went through the whole procedure to get the dental records when, as we discussed, she wasn't out there that long.
Yeah.
This person, the body they found, had, presumably, the physical characteristics lined up, but then also they described to a T what Kaysera was wearing, and this body had those clothes. Why wouldn't they have just called in a family member to identify the body rather than charge the state to do all these things, prolong the family's agony?
They have this story that the decomposition is just too far gone, that it doesn't seem to line up with the realities of decomp as we understand it. But that's part of this story for some reason. And I wish I had an answer. I have no idea. To think of, I'm looking at these dates and I'm thinking of each one of these blocks is 24 hours that you have that family member wondering where she is, trying to find her. And it could have been as simple as one investigator saying, oh, wait, we've got this cell phone. Let me throw it on the charger. I'm going to call the family real quick. I'm going to ask them to call her phone. That's it. They would have, it wouldn't have been an official identification, but at that point, law enforcement could have had a very serious conversation with the family about, we found a body, we found a phone on it, the phone is hers. And the family would have known back the 31st or September 1st.
Yeah. And that would have been a great way too, to not re-victimize the family and say, hey, can you look at these clothes? Or can you try to make an identification based on the state in which they say her remains were? Just call the phone.
Yeah. Well, and I'm wondering what's happening with this investigation. Do you think they're pulling the phone records or pulling GPS information, trying to see if they could trace where that phone went over that evening and then possibly into the following week?
That's a good point.
They're doing something with the phone.
Yeah. Yeah. So what does the family do next when they do eventually find out? It's unbelievable.
So the family is told it's going to take some time to cremate Kaysera. So they leave and they attempt to find and visit the site where Kaysera's body was found, but they can't find it because there's no crime scene tape or demarcation of where the body was found. And, as you can imagine, the family is just feeling really defeated. 2 days later, on the 14th, they finally find the site of where Kaysera's body was found with the help of people who live across the street from the scene. And they're absolutely shocked. And this seems where an area where law enforcement once again fell down, because they could have, taken the family and visited the crime scene with them so they knew where their daughter and loved one were found.
It just seems like communication is just completely blown between the two sides here. And
Absolutely.
Maybe it reaches back further than we know. Maybe there's, a bunch of run-ins that they've had with the family or with her in particular. I don't know, but none of that makes any of this right. Like this.
And again, they're supposed to be professionals, so they should be able to rise above this and do their duty.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so you're right, the family is stunned when they do eventually find the location of where Kaysera was found, because like we talked about earlier, realizing that this is a highly visible area that sees a lot of driving traffic. And they also note while they're there, especially on that weekend, that it's a suburban atmosphere. It's vibrant, it's alive with activity. And they're honestly just confused about how the remains of a teenager could be ignored for days. And so it's also on September the 14th that the family does get permission to access the backyard corner from inside the fence to perform a cultural ceremony. And they also speak with a neighbor, Jason Cummings, who again was the man who found Kaysera's body. And Jason says that he distinctly remembers the police removing Kaysera's phone from her pocket when they arrived. And Jason suggested to the police that, hey, maybe you should charge the phone so that they could find her family. And that he also said that the police should be securing the scene. And so when he's vocal about all of these things, the police simply tell him that he should stay out of the situation.
So things will get even more out of hand on September 16th when the family goes back to the mortuary for visitation and to pick up Kaysera's ashes. But when they arrive, they find that her remains aren't even there. So the family contacts Terry Bolas's sister, who says they will arrive in 45 minutes. When they don't arrive, the family is told, just come back tomorrow. We have to close at 4. I'm glad they refuse to leave, and they wait for Kaysera's ashes to arrive, and they finally get them at 5:30 p.m.
Mm-hmm. And it's important to note, too, just remembering that in this incident where they're waiting for the ashes, Terry's sister says that they don't know where they are, that they couldn't remember if they were at the other crime lab or who had the ashes, which is part of why the timing gets messed up there, which is just another incident of just, lack of attention. Yeah, exactly. And so this is like the straw that breaks the camel's back, if there's many. But it's after this incident that the family launches into their own full steam investigation that they do conduct themselves. They reach out to the Deputy Attorney General and they request information on all of the reports, but they get blocked from a lot of different avenues. And they learn that Montana does not have a waiting period for missing persons reports. And they also learn, after weeks of trying to get a meeting with the investigating captain, Captain Mike Fuss, that Kaysera's remains repeatedly went back and forth between Bolas's mortuary and the crime lab because Bolas was acting independently of police direction. So Mike Fuss was also strangely tight-lipped about Kaysera's cell phone. And in this meeting, he does reportedly slip up to the family saying that he is surprised that they even know that evidence exists.
Then, in a conversation outside of the official investigation, Grace Boltail, who is Kaysera's aunt, says she independently spoke with the DOJ Crime Lab ME, who told her that Kaysera's cause of death was asphyxiation, by strangulation, and that there were signs of assault. And if we think back, when we talked about the report earlier, they said it was undetermined. Right. That asphyxiation was a possibility, but they couldn't say that it was that. So by the end of September and early October of 2019, Kaysera's family had advocated so much that they got national attention for Kaysera's case, and the FBI was requested to join in on the investigation. This forced Bighorn County to create a special task force to investigate MMIP cases, and it's all the national attention that really forces their hand on publishing a document of their investigative experience.
Mm-hmm. And it seems as though to either offer anecdotal evidence for a perspective, this public document insinuates that Kaysera had trouble controlling her drinking. And Bighorn County Sheriff's Office say that they found school records that indicated in the spring before her death, Kaysera was found unresponsive at Hardin High School due to a high level of alcohol intoxication, which prompted a trip to the emergency room. And so with that posted, additional medical records also confirmed that Kaysera was under treatment for asthma. So this public presentation of information by the police officers, it's almost meant to kind of lead you down one rabbit hole, that Kaysera's death was a result of drinking and her health.
And tripping over a 4-foot high fence. I just,
Well, and if Kaysera did have an alcohol problem, which, I don't know if there is evidence that she did or didn't, but regardless, it still does not mean it's irrelevant as to whether her death should be investigated or not. But then I think that, that the blood alcohol that they discussed earlier, it was 0.138, I believe, if she really does have a history of consuming large amounts of alcohol, that's really not going to be anything for her. So that kind of conflicts with that theory that she was so drunk, because that wouldn't, if she had a drinking problem, that 0.138 is not going to be that bad for her.
No, and we're not hearing any other types of indicators unless she drank so much alcohol that all of a sudden her body functions just all ceased at the same time. Like, we're not hearing they found dirt in her mouth, in her lungs, in her air passage, like, things that might lead you to believe, oh, this was some type of prolonged medical event that was happening. She fell face down. She was too drunk, didn't realize what, just the other pieces for that type of conclusion definitely aren't coming from the coroner's report. And the one light of hope I had in this whole thing was the fact that they sent her remains to the DOJ state crime lab. Cause I'm like, okay, if this is, good old boys network situation, getting it out of that circle into another area where maybe they don't have that type of influence might be a good thing for this case. We're hearing kind of, that the family has had a conversation with someone there, and that information lines up much more with kind of the elements I'm seeing in this case, that there's certainly an attack that happened, but that's not on any official record anywhere.
Yeah. And this whole thing of putting out that she has a drinking problem or that she has a health issue seems to be a smear tactic rather than actual investigative facts that they've come across.
I agree. It's like a simple way for them to try to point you in the direction of that this was an accident, that she was
victim blaming.
Yeah. Truly. Yeah. That oh my God, she had asthma and she couldn't breathe and she was drinking, and then she finds herself cornered in a backyard and she just dies.
Well,
that
and they
doesn't make any sense.
She has such a drinking problem. They had to go back to her school record and go looking for information. And they would know, like, they'd be bumping into her, out around town constantly over and over. Unfortunately, I know I have family members that have dealt with substance abuse issues. Law enforcement gets to know them extremely quickly. So if they didn't have their own chain of records about all the different times they bumped into her and she was underage drinking, and by the way, I don't know about that state in particular, but in some states, one charge for underage drinking and they put off your ability to have a driver's license until you're 21. Like, where's all those records? Where's all the pretense for, no, we got, it was reported at her school once that there was an issue. I don't know.
It also feels like it could be a dog whistle too, and a racially motivated smear.
Kind of. Yeah. So yeah, it looks like it's really easy to be a believer of one single theory. I know we keep kind of circling around it with this one, that there's some law enforcement thing that's going on here. It's a fact that this is a suspicious death investigation where Kaysera's cause of death was deemed undetermined. What theories have you guys seen online, or are people thinking or talking about any other aspects other than the one that we're all very focused on, obviously?
The most prominent one that I personally have seen is something regarding the police, and it happening as a result of Kaysera filming her brother being attacked by these same officers. I'll be honest and say I don't know what happened. It's hard really with all of these different pieces to know. It does seem like incompetence is, that's at a minimum what's happened here with the police, and really a careless disregard for this family and this victim.
Yeah. And thinking too about some of the other theories that I've seen online, of course, like we were just talking about, the freak accident concept is one that people discuss, but I haven't seen a lot of information out there. And then thinking, of course, could this be a sinister local person that murdered Kaysera? Possibly. I think with this case, there are so many conflicting pieces of information that it's almost like we don't know what's real evidence and what's not. Sometimes with cases like this, I like to think about, I love the show House with Dr. Gregory House and the, investigative medical stuff, because the way that they look at diagnoses are very similar to, I think, how detectives look at some cases. And it's interesting in some of those episodes where when you break down the symptoms, if you take away one symptom that you think is related to an illness, suddenly the whole thing becomes clear because one thing that was a symptom isn't really. So in a case like this, if we look at it in terms of the evidence, and if you start taking out, maybe this piece isn't really evidence, do other things start to shine through? And I think in general, again, it's so clouded that I don't know that we can even lean in a direction.
I worry about that too, because especially with this information, we could just be telling the story of a not great coroner. And we could be telling a story about bad communication with law enforcement, which, by the way, I feel like I tell that story every week on this channel, like especially with missing persons cases. So those things not completely out of the norm. I almost wish if their official conclusion that they're coming to is this is some type of alcohol related death, there is no one else involved, close the case. Let us FOIA it. Let us look through what happened with your investigation. Because I'll tell you, in terms of what I'm seeing there, they should have talked to everyone she was hanging out with that night. We're talking the two girls, the older boyfriend. By the way, is there any charges? Did anyone file any charges against this 23-year-old that's providing alcohol to people underage? Did they invest?
Well, and I think that's also an investigative path as well. I mean,
yes. Yeah.
The reason Kaysera fled was because there was some sort of domestic dispute going on. And, you know, could something have happened as a result of that fight? Were there heated emotions? Did it get out of control? So to your point, John, like, are there charges? Did they look into why this man was providing these younger women with alcohol, underage women with alcohol? And what about that domestic incident?
Also, I believe, at least according to what the family said in their video, he might have been dating someone that was underage. There could be other charges that would come along with that. But where her body was found, was it processed forensically? Did they look for handprints or fingerprints or anything on the fence? Like someone might have handled that as they were trying to get her over it. Did they go through the neighborhood? Did they canvass the neighborhood? Did they ask the neighbors for all of their information? Like, I really think having access to their investigative file, it would probably help them if they really did look at this and do all that footwork for that information to become public. If that information isn't there, it's going to be really interesting as well. And I don't know, I would bet there's a very good chance that this case is going to stay in kind of active, but not really being worked on status if this is kind of the worst situation that we're thinking, where for some reason there's some kind of cover up that's going on around this. But so where does the case stand today?
So one of the fuels for hope for Kaysera's family was the FBI involvement. But unfortunately, that didn't pan out either. The FBI said that it was not going to investigate because Kaysera's body was found a half-mile off the Crow Reservation border. So they're saying no jurisdiction. But she wasn't found on native land. So they would.
That doesn't make any sense at all. Unless something's being misreported to them. Unless, you know, they're calling local law enforcement. They're like, oh, no, that she was found on the reservation. Oh, okay, we can't do anything about that. Like, what? And if that's the case, shouldn't there be an agency within the reservation? Because I know frequently the reservations will have their own form of law enforcement in some way.
And that's a whole other episode, right? These crazy jurisdiction issues that allow crimes to be committed on reservation land, and them not being able to, you know, do anything about it, to be honest. Yeah,
well, and I know that some of those enforcement agencies, like, you know, budgeting is really, really difficult for them as well. So resources probably another issue. But
So now Kaysera's case is really at a point where investigators could benefit from the public's help. Even if our help is pressuring them to close it and show us what they've got, or to do a little more investigation. But you can dive in for yourself at uncovered.com's page for this case. The address is on your screen, and we also have a link in the description box below.
There you can see all of our sources and the full timeline for Kaysera's case, considering there are dozens more events that we didn't even touch upon in this episode that happened after the fact with the investigation. And so on Uncovered's website, you can also find resources for more information on the MMIP epidemic.
Kaysera Stops Pretty Places' case is one that clearly needs more exposure and more questions answered. Please share this video and our page at uncovered.com with any friends or family you have in the Montana area. Kaysera's aunt, Grace, told Dateline she wants people to know that advocacy doesn't have to end with sharing her case on social media, and that there's still so much more to do by being educated and getting involved with good causes. And of course, the biggest help for Kaysera is if you know something, say something. You can submit tips to the Bighorn County Investigator at the number that's been on the screen, 406-665-9780. If you think those tips should not go into that agency or you need to remain anonymous, please contact CrimeStoppers at 512-472-8477 or by using the CrimeStoppers app. Thank you to justiceforkaysera.org and the Justice for Kaysera YouTube channel, Bighorn County Sheriff's Office, Al Jazeera, NBC News, Dateline, Change.org, KTVQ, KHQQ6, Montana Murder Mysteries Podcast, The Crime Report, Cults, Crime, and Cabernet, Democracy Now!, The Montana Standard, CNN, Billings Gazette, Great Falls Tribune, CBS 2 News, Oxygen, NBC 8, CBS 9, Indian County Today, and Wikipedia. Also, a big thank you to my friends at Uncovered.com and co-hosts on today's show, Rachel Rosalette and Andrea Cipriano. Please join us again in 2 weeks as we look into another mystery that deserves to be uncovered.